Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode in a series where I discuss alcohol's video games and their relative real-world counterparts. If you're a fan of The Elder Scrolls, you'll know that the economy makes little to no sense. After reading far too many Reddit theories, I've come to agree with you/Hichiro. I believe a gold drake, that is 1 septim for you youngins, weighs about 30.536 grams. Based on relative size to common objects, which would make it roughly $2,328 at the time of writing the script. The value is, of course, assuming that the coins are 24-karat gold, which is a safe assumption given the transmutation spell found in Skyrim. We must account for two factors with the cost of the septim. Firstly, the USD is no longer backed by a gold standard, which severely impacts its purchasing power. Secondly, gold has radically increased in value over the past few years, and in the Elder Scrolls it seems abundant. Ultimately, this hunt for the value of a septim did not help me figure out the aggregated cost of living in Cyrodiil during the latter half of the Third Era. Thinking back to high school economics, I turned instead to look at the relative price of goods. A loaf of bread is 1 septim. Beer is 1 septim, as is lettuce and many other staple groceries. So we can assume, based on bread pricing at my local Rayleigh's, that is Nob Hill or Bel Air, that a septim is roughly $5. Which still leaves me with a problem regarding the price of wine and beer versus the price of their component ingredients. In the case of wine, a cluster of grapes weighs 0.1 and is worth 2 septims. Using the weight of 1 bottle, I can assume that a bunch of grapes weighs 0.26 pounds. On average, a gallon of wine takes 13.3 pounds of grapes, or 51 clusters of the in-game grapes, which is the equivalent of 102 septims, to make 4 bottles of wine. Albeit, this is at retail rather than wholesale cost. Wine can then sell for as little as 2 septims. And I'm sure Todd will say, it just works. But it doesn't. We can, however, glean some information on the vinification practices at play in Cyrodiil. From the relative price of grapes, we can assume that being a negociant is not a viable career path. This indicates that Cirili and Tamika have the wine industry in a stranglehold. Ales, beers, and meads also suffer from disproportionately priced ingredients, but I will spare you from some of my ramblings there. Unless, of course, you want me to try and rationalize that in another video. Let me know in the comments below. Part 1. Ale and beer are shown in smaller 375 ml bottles, but weigh 1, which, based on my earlier calculations, indicate the bottles are in fact 750 ml. Beer and ale are found across the map, but can be purchased for 2 and 5 septims, respectively. Why use a distinction of ale and beer? Well, beer is already broken down into 2 categories, ale and lager. I have a feeling that ale does, in fact, represent what we conceive of as ale, while beer is being used in the place of lager to make the delineation between styles. In a modern view, our differentiation between the two is made solely based on yeast. That leaves us with a wide swath of what the 2 beers in-game could actually be. For the sake of giving you real-world examples, here are some of my personal favorites to meet medieval styles that you would expect from the setting. So, go to your local seller of fine and rare import beers and look for some Praha Pilsner or Orval. For Neuheim's Special Brew, looking for a strong beer like a triple or a quadruple, think Trappist de Rochefort, and serve in a fine tankard to honor your fighter's guildmates, though, in a modern sense, please use a chalice. Mead sits at an interesting place. There are a couple of styles present in the game. We have 2 from the base game and 1 from DLC. Of the base game meads, we have regular mead and rosethorn mead. Mead is a honey wine often associated with Germanic traditions and culture. It is the universal way to show you're not some weak-livered milk drinker. Mead can be found in two styles, carbonic low ABV mead or still mead that is much stronger. Both meads in the base game have a weight of 1, so we will assume once again that they are 750 ml bottles. Regular mead can be purchased for 2 septims, and as the owner of Rosethorn Hall, the special mead from the cellar is free. But we can guess that the Rosethorn mead is of a greater quality than the mead found commonly around the map. If you are looking to purchase mead to quench your thirst, then I would suggest Danskmjöl, available at most retailers. Now, perhaps you want that fine Rosethorn mead to show your friends how much you love Skingrad's aristocratic lifestyle. Then I cannot recommend Schramm's mead enough. Rosethorn Hall's wonderful ambiance and style puts me in mind of the lovely Marion Berry mead from Schramm's. Now, a quick trip through the West Wealds to the Colovian Highlands will take us to Battlehorn Castle. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, you may want to buy some DLC, like horse armor. Talon, the castle's resident wine geek, will be able to make wines and meads for you if you bring him the requisite ingredients. So get ready to boost your alchemy skill so you can successfully harvest. Once you have all the ingredients, some dragon's tongue and some lady's smock, you have Numbskin's mead, which I am once again convinced is Schramm's mead. I believe it to be the Tasmanian Leatherwood Blossom mead, but that's not always available. So if you're in the Massachusetts area, I would say it could be Singularity 1 by Bliss Point Meadery. Part 2. Wines and their great vintages. Wine takes a more interesting shape, with many different bottlings coming through 2 major wine houses. We can assume that they produce all the readily available wine, barring that of the DLC wines from the Shivering Isles and Battlehorn Castle. Shadow Banish wine also doesn't come from Cerilli Brothers Estate or Tamika Family Wines. Before we talk about specific estates, I would like to enumerate which grapes I think grow in Cyrodiil and why we may or may not see them in various bottlings. I think we can assume the Noble Six, Chardonnay, Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, and Merlot would be grown across Cyrodiil and, frankly, all of Tamriel. We can also assume that the heavy Roman influence will result in the cultivation of many Italic varietals. For these I put forth Barbera, Sangiovese, Montepulciano, Nebbiolo, Aglianico, Primitivo, Dolcetto, Trebbiano, Pinot Grigio, Verdecchio, and Arnese. We could also see some German and Austrian grapes like Müller-Thurgau, Zweigelt, Gewürztraminer, Weissburgunder, that's Pinot Blanc, Blaufränkisch, and St. Laurent. When we look at the wine bottles, there's almost no distinction in shape or color, which could mean the glass being used is deep brown, and the wines theoretically come in both red and white variations from the vineyards, or that the vintners of Cyrodiil are making golden wine. Today, we start with the glorious swill that is cheap wine, found in every cavern and inn, but mostly at my parents' house. These wines can be found visualized in large format, magnum, bottles in the Bordeaux style. It only has a weight of 1 and is sold for 2 septims, so despite its relative size on the table, we must assume that cheap wine is still sold in a nice 750 ml format. Given the clear correlation between medieval Europe and Cyrodiil, I expect us to have a few options for cheap wine, although a distinction is not present in the game. On the more German style of wine, I can see it being Zweigelt. Burger comes to mind, with the large bottle. It could come from the Italic style and be something like Sangiovese, or if it's from the French influence, I see it being cheap Bordeaux or some Glu-Glu of Gamay. For those of us who are American and can't find the good, cheap European stuff, I'm afraid we must stick with Kirkland, Carlo Rossi, or Sutterholm. As we begin to look at the estates that are producing more expensive and vintage wines, we move to the quiet hillside and sunny slopes outside of Skingrad to the Sorilli Brothers estate. The estate produces 3 wines, a base cuvée, and 2 vintages. Their standard wine can be purchased for as little as 5 septums. The other vintages, a 3.99 for 30 septums and a 4.15 for 15 septums. This is interesting. It implies that the year is only given to exceptional harvests. This means that they treat their wine in a similar way to champagne, telling us the area around Skingrad is one of the nicest viticultural zones in Tamriel. The base wine is probably a blend of various vintages to keep flavor consistent. Sorilli Estate gave me the impression of northern Italy, so I posit that their wines are going to be reflective of Piemonte and Alto Adige with a fair balance of Tuscan Sangiovese. For their regular vintage, I think that Caltresi, which is Schiava or Trollinger, would safely represent the wine. I would reach for a bottle of Erste New if you can find it. The 415 is, in my mind, a Rosso di Montalcino, specifically the 2016 vintage by Sesti. The 3.99 strikes me as a Brunello, a wine aged to glorious perfection with a sturdy tannic weight. For the 3.99, I think we can safely assume this Brunello is from Poder le Rippi, one of my favorite vineyards. The wine stands out as Lupi e Cirine Riserva. That brings us to the largest vineyard in Cyrodiil, the Tamika estate, which boasts 70 vines planted on their property. They too only produce 3 wines, Tamika West Weald, 415 vintage and 399 vintage, which cost 8, 20, and 35 septums respectively. Tamika seemed to take inspiration from the French, with a hint of Ostani culture. Tamika charges a premium for her wines. While we now have great research into which grapes work best in various soil types to produce the best wines, I doubt the vineyards of Cyrodiil took much notice of this. We can assume that the greater number of vines planted at Tamika allows them to grow a wider range of grapes, or allows them to thin out the clusters of the grapes to concentrate flavors. The West Weald wine feels like it would be more easy drinking, something like Tourette made from Petit Rouge. I went for a wine off the beaten path, something that most people wouldn't have tried before, but a wine from a place with a long history of viticulture in steep valleys. For the vintage wines produced by Tamika, I took inspiration from Bordeaux. The 415 vintage would be something like a Grand Vin de Bordeaux, while the 399 would be a first growth Bordeaux. Let us turn now to a venerable vintage, Shadow Banish wine. That most magical of viticultural elixirs, with the power to give night vision in vino veritas. The wine can only be found in old imperial forts and DLC houses, which tells me that it is an age-worthy wine, something with great staying power. For me, that makes it Barolo, especially because of the strong Italic influence present in imperial culture. Wine is radically expanded in the DLCs, with Battlehorn Castle introducing 6 new wines alone. The Shivering Isles add 6 as well, bringing the DLC wine total to 12. I will start with the wines from Battlehorn Castle. We have all bottles coming in at a weight of 1, so we assume, like all bottles so far, that they're 750 mLs. We have Aragonian Blood Wine for 20 septums, Clovian Battlecry for 25, Frostu Blanc for 20, Giuliano's Firebelly for 25, Sparkling Honeydew for 30, and Stumblefoot's Reserve for 30. These seem like Loire Valley wines to me. Coral feels very French in influence, and we know that it is mostly populated by Bretons. Aragonian Blood Wine has 2 potentials for me, and they are both outliers, hailing not from Loire. If I keep the French influence, then it is Gamay from Morgon. And if I throw the French influence out the window and adopt a more Italic and Balkan influence, it is Terran or Refosque. That is to say, wines that are sanguine, saline, and earthy. Now, for the easy grouping of wines, this is the fast-paced section, so without further ado, Colovion Battle Cry is Cab Franc, probably from Bourgogne. Frost du Blanc is Chenin or Sauvignon Blanc, Julianos Firebelly is Pinot d'Agny, Sparkling Honeydew is probably a botrytis-affected Vouvray, and Stumblefoot's Reserve is a Caux heavy blend, something that just really sneaks up on you. Crossing through a door in the Niben Bay, we end up in our favorite locale, the Shivering Isles. We have 3 wines made by Bernice and 3 in the Felmore line. Placing a wine region on the borders of mania or dementia is a challenge, to say the least. So instead of that, I looked at the Shivering Isles themselves, and honestly it reminded me a lot of Greece, which resulted in the wines from the Shivering Isles being based on Greek traditions. Of Bernice's wines, only 2 are readily available. The other is a singular bottle that I nearly overlooked for 3 months while making this video. In my defense, the Elder Scrolls fandom page for beverages in Oblivion doesn't have it either. Roofwater wine for 15 septims and summer wine for 5 strike me as easy drinking reds. Bernice's Alley wine for 30 septims, which is found in Split, in the home of Urulgro Agamph, strikes me as a bolder red like Xinomavro. Roofwater wine seems to make sense as Kotsifali. Summer wine is a cheap and drinkable wine like Assyrtiko. For the Felmore line, we see the Spore wine is the most expensive at 35, Swamp wine is 20, and the base red is 8. The pricing structure between Bernice and Felmore is reminiscent of Tamika and Cyrilli. Felmore Spore wine, while in the Shivering Isles, probably has some fungal influences, and I had to think of real-world wines without the incursion of alchemy. So for me, Moscofilero makes sense as Spore wine. It has a floral and sweet musky aroma about it, something mushroomy. Swamp wines stood out instantly, as there is only one Greek wine that I have ever thought of as fetid and rotten as swamp water. Retsina. Which is not a condemnation of the whole style. It can just go horribly awry. Retsina is made with Savatiano and takes on pine flavors from the resin used to seal the traditional amphorae. We then hit the Felmore Red, which doesn't seem to be anything too fancy, so I'm assuming it's a table wine of Agiorgatico. Part 3. Spirits. For what it's worth. There aren't many spirits present in Oblivion. In fact, in the base game, there is only Cyrodiilic Brandy. DLC adds Daedric Lava Whiskey. There is no price associated with Daedric Lava Whiskey, but we do know it comes from the plains of the Daedric Prince of Destruction. Given the plains of Dagon, we can picture a volcanic landscape full of lava. In my head, I saw Iceland and their stellar, floky single malt whiskey. One would think Cyrodiilic Brandy would be easier to figure out, but it took me over 6 hours while sitting in my local high-end wine and spirit store, Craft Wine and Beer, to come up with 4 potentials. Retailing at 79 septims, this is absolutely a luxury item. But brandy isn't always on the fancy side. To deal with this, I have made a list taking Cyrodiilic Brandy from a cheap product to the height of luxury. We begin with Père Dom Brandy, followed by Hospice de Beaune Brandy, De Rosa Armagnac, I like the 8, 12, and 20 years. Anything older than that, and the flavor starts to fall off. I've tasted everything up to the 50 year. Finally, we have Souvenir Imperial Navarra Cognac. This is a broad category because I expect the brandy in the game is not produced by one person in one place, but instead a product that is made by alchemists all over Cyrodiil and would thus reflect local styles and character. Part 4. Honorable Mentions. A quick note here. Daedric Lava Whiskey says beer on the label and appears in a beer bottle. I am convinced this was an oversight on the developer's part. The UESP lists skooma as a beverage, but since we all know that it is a drug, we can safely say it doesn't belong in our discussion of wine and spirits. But if you want me to discuss skooma and moon sugar, leave a comment and send me to Morrowind to explore the exotic worlds of Sujamma and Flynn. Hop into the comments and tell me what games you would like me to explore next. And, Eric from the future here to let you know that if you want me to do a wine pairing curated just for you, you can follow the QR code on the screen or click the link down below. Thanks again for watching. Bye.